The Cathara translator logged the moment at 0.003 seconds, past the Emperor's final syllable, a response time so precise it should have been impossible for biological tissue to achieve. But the human ambassador had not waited for the translation to complete. She had answered before the machine could finish rendering the words into a language her species understood. The Cathara translator logged this anomaly and filed it under a category it had never used before: premature comprehension. Nobody in the throne chamber of the Velith Dominion noticed. Nobody thought to ask why. They were all still laughing. Her name was Mara Solis, and she had been awake for 31 hours by the time she stood before the emperor of a civilization that had existed longer than her species had possessed written language. She was 38 years old, which meant she had lived precisely 1/3 of a Cathara standard year. She was wearing diplomatic attire that had been designed by committee, approved by Parliament, revised 6 times, and still managed to look slightly wrong, too angular at the shoulders, too asymmetrical in the color choices, a pale blue that the Velith chromatic registry interpreted as the color used to mark food animals in transit. Nobody had told her this. She would learn it later when it was too late to matter. The Emperor's laughter lasted 11 seconds. It had a wet, resonant quality. The Cathara larynx produces sound through oscillating membrane clusters rather than a single vocal cord, which means their laughter is not one sound but many, layered like an organ chord. It was, by any external measure, beautiful. It was also the most humiliating sound Mara Solis had ever heard directed at her. She stood still. She waited. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and her left thumb was pressed hard into her right palm, a habit she'd developed in her 20s, when she'd learned that pain, even small pain, even self-administered pain, could anchor a person when the ground felt like it was moving beneath them. The ground was not moving. The throne chamber's floor was 3 meters of polished, iridescent stone that had been quarried from a moon that no longer existed. Nothing about it moved. But Mara's mind was calculating, and when Mara's mind calculated under pressure, the rest of her body needed something to hold onto. The Emperor spoke again, and this time the translator caught every word. The Terran delegation presents its proposal for a ceasefire with the sincerity of a species that does not yet understand what a ceasefire means. You have lost 14 of your 23 colony systems. Your fleet has been reduced to what our analysts generously estimate as 17% of pre-conflict capability. Your homeworld is undefended, and you come to my chamber in a garment that marks you as livestock, though I will not insult you by explaining this, and you ask me to pause, as though the word pause means anything to an empire that has been expanding for 6,000 of your years. More laughter from the assembled court. Mara counted them. 47 Cathara nobility, 3 military commanders, 2 archivists, 1 creature in the far corner that she could not identify and that her briefing documents had not mentioned. She noted the creature and filed it. "The answer," the Emperor said, his membrane voice dropping into the lower frequencies that the translator rendered with a kind of bass vibration she felt in her sternum, "is no. The answer was always no. You were brought here so that your government would understand the answer came from my mouth and not from a subordinate. I am told your species places significance on such things. You wanted to be heard. You have been heard. The interpreter will show you to your transport." Mara Solis did not move. This was the first moment that something changed in the throne chamber, though no one could have named it. The laughter faded not because it was finished, but because the 47 nobles were waiting for the human to begin moving toward the exit. She was not moving. She was standing in the precise geometric center of the audience floor, her hands behind her back, her thumb pressing into her palm, her eyes on the Emperor's face. "Ambassador," the interpreter said quietly in human accented standard, "the Emperor has concluded the—" "I heard him," Mara said, and then she said something else. She said it in Cathara, not in the simplified trade Cathara that most human diplomats spent 3 years learning, but in Old Court Cathara, the formal register used only in imperial addresses, a linguistic form the Dominion had not heard spoken by a non-Cathara voice in recorded history. She said, "I was not finished." The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. The translator, still running its background analyses, logged a second anomaly. The Emperor's secondary membrane, the thin tissue layer beneath his primary features that controls involuntary emotional display among the Cathara, had briefly shifted into a chromatic pattern the machine categorized as acute attention. Not anger, not offense. Attention. The kind of attention given to something unexpected. The Emperor had not expected old court Cathara from the livestock ambassador. Mara knew she had perhaps 90 seconds before the guards were ordered to physically remove her. She had planned for 60. She spoke quickly, but not hurriedly. There is a difference, and the Cathara, who had spent 6,000 years developing the art of measured speech, understood the difference instinctively. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are choosing each word from a large and carefully considered inventory. She said, "The Emperor has heard what I have asked. He has not yet heard why I asked it. I will tell him why, not because I believe it will change his answer, but because in 40 years, when the history of this moment is written, I want the record to reflect that I told him." Another pause. She was not done. "We are not here because we believe we can win this war. We are here because we have decided we will not stop fighting it. Those are different things. I need the Emperor to understand the difference before I leave." She left. The interpreter escorted her out. The 47 nobles began speaking immediately, the way crowds do when something has made them uncomfortable, and they need the sound of their own voices to reassure themselves. But the Emperor sat still for a long time after the doors closed, long enough that 3 of the nobles fell quiet and began watching him. Long enough that his secondary membrane cycled through 4 distinct chromatic states before settling, unusually, into the pattern that Cathara physiologists would describe as something close to the equivalent of a sleepless night. Not fear, something more uncomfortable than fear, a thought he could not quite finish. The war had begun, as so many wars do, over something that neither side would later be able to explain to outside observers without sounding like they had misunderstood the question. The Cathara Dominion had been expanding along a spiral arm of the galaxy that contained, until recently, no civilizations worth diplomatic contact. Their expansion was not violent in intent. They did not seek to destroy, only to absorb, to incorporate, to add to the vast bureaucratic architecture of their empire. They had done this with 11 other species over 6,000 years. 8 of those species had integrated successfully. 2 had declined and been contained. One had been, the official record used the word resolved, and the unofficial record did not discuss it at all. Humanity had not been on anyone's expansion map because humanity had not, until 80 years before this story, been anywhere except one solar system. Then they had been somewhere else. Then many somewhere elses. This was not unusual in the galaxy. Most species, given sufficient time, eventually spread. What was unusual was the speed. What was unusual was the lack of apparent plan. The Cathara had a 6,000-year expansion roadmap, revised every century, optimized by artificial intelligences that had been running continuously for longer than human civilization had possessed metallurgy. Humanity had expanded the way a liquid expands when the container breaks, in every direction simultaneously, with no apparent concern for geometry or efficiency. By the time the Dominion's forward scouts encountered the first human colony world, humanity had settled 23 systems, not because they had planned to settle those 23 systems specifically, but because 23 groups of humans had looked at those systems and thought, we could live there, and then had. The Cathara had classified the situation as Category 3, an emerging species with territorial conflict potential requiring either diplomatic absorption or containment. They had opened contact. The contact had not gone well. The diplomatic absorption offer had been, and this was the part the Cathara analysts kept returning to in their reports, the part that didn't parse correctly, refused. Not refused on grounds of sovereignty or pride or fear. Refused because the human representative had read the terms, read them again, put them down and said, "No one who signed this will be alive by the time any of these clauses come due. It's not a treaty. It's a document for species who plan to outlive their negotiators. We don't think that way. The Cathara had interpreted this as cultural confusion. They had tried again with modified terms. The response had been similar. They had tried a third time. The human representative, a different one which itself was confusing, since the Dominion's diplomatic protocols assumed continuity of representation, had said something that the translator had flagged as potentially corrupted, because the sentence did not syntactically organize the way the machine expected a refusal to organize. She had said, "You're asking us to agree to who will be in 200 years. We don't know who will be in 200 years. Nobody does. That's not a flaw." That's the point. The war had started 6 months later, not because either side wanted war, but because the Cathara had interpreted the refusals as aggression, and humanity had interpreted the continued pressure to sign as an implicit threat, and two species who are both afraid often find it easier to act than to continue being afraid. 9 years of war had followed. The Cathara, with an empire of 6,000 years and military infrastructure calibrated across hundreds of star systems, had expected it to last 18 months. Humanity, with 80 years of interstellar capability, and a fleet that had been built during the first 3 years of conflict from raw materials and collective improvisation that the Dominion's analysts described as logistically incoherent, had expected, well, nobody had asked them what they expected. That was possibly the first mistake. Mara Solis returned to the human diplomatic transport and sat in the forward cabin for 4 hours without speaking to anyone. Her aide, a 26-year-old from Lagos named Quame who had been assigned to her 18 months ago, and who had survived 3 separate combat evacuations during that time, with the specific calmness of someone who has learned that panic is metabolically expensive, brought her water, and then sat quietly at the other end of the cabin and did not ask questions. After 4 hours, Mara said, "How long until we're out of their communication intercept range?" 17 minutes, Quame said, as though he had been waiting for exactly this question. "Then in 17 minutes send the signal." Quame nodded. He did not ask which signal. He knew which signal. He had known about the signal since before they had departed for the Dominion's territory. He had in fact been the one to encode it, using a method that the Cathara's intelligence services would later spend 8 months trying to reconstruct and would ultimately classify as human cryptographic methodology: logic defiant, pattern absent, apparently random but demonstrably intentional, mechanism unknown. The mechanism was not unknown. It was very old. It was older than the Cathara Empire by approximately 3,000 years. It was a one-time pad, which is mathematically unbreakable, which Quame had encoded in longhand on physical paper using a key that existed on no digital medium anywhere in the galaxy, which he had memorized, and which he would burn from memory once it was used, by the simple act of intentionally never thinking about it again. A technique he had read about in a book on wartime intelligence that had been written before spaceflight, before computers, before almost anything the galaxy would have recognized as technology. 17 minutes later, he sent the signal. 12 hours after that, in 14 separate star systems, things began to happen. The Cathara military commander who first realized something was wrong was named Vel Cathos, a name that translates roughly as sustained clarity, which had always seemed appropriate for someone who had spent 40 years as a strategic analyst. Vel Cathos was not at the front of the war. He was at the Dominion's administrative core, surrounded by 6,000 years of accumulated military intelligence, and he was looking at a tactical display that had just updated with information from the 14 systems that should have been, by any rational military calculation, the quietest sectors in the conflict. They were the quietest sectors because they were deep within Cathara territory. Not border territory, not contested territory. The kind of territory that the Dominion's strategic models did not even categorize as war space, because war space is where enemies can reach you, and the enemy could not reach here. The fleet projections were clear. The logistical analysis was unambiguous. The 14 systems represented the deep infrastructure of the Dominion's military supply chain, fuel processing, ammunition manufacture, the slow-moving industrial arteries that kept the Empire's war machine operating across hundreds of light years. 14 systems. Simultaneously. Vel'Cathos looked at the display for a long time. He looked at it the way someone looks at a sentence that appears to be grammatically correct but somehow fails to mean anything. Then he looked at it again. Then he called for his senior analyst. "Tell me," he said, "when these human operatives entered Dominion space." The analyst checked. The analyst checked again. The analyst brought in a secondary system and checked a third time. Then the analyst said something that Vel'Cathos would replay in his memory for the rest of his life. "Sir, based on travel time from the border, accounting for known human vessel capabilities, accounting for optimal routing, these operatives would have had to enter Dominion space before the war started." Vel'Cathos was quiet for a long time. "How long before?" "The earliest estimated insertion point," the analyst said carefully, as though each word needed to be placed precisely, "is approximately 4 years before the first engagement." 4 years. Humanity had been placing operatives inside Dominion space, deep inside, not border deep, but core deep, infrastructure deep, 4 years before the war began, before any of the failed diplomatic contact, before the Category 3 classification, possibly before humanity had any official knowledge that the Cathara Dominion existed. Vel'Cathos pulled up the human settlement records. He looked at the dates. He looked at the expansion pattern, that apparently liquid, directionless, geometrically chaotic spread across 23 systems. He looked at the specific locations. He looked at them in relation to Dominion space. He looked at them in relation to the deep supply chains currently experiencing simultaneous, coordinated disruption. The 23 colony systems were not random. They were not the result of individual groups of humans looking at stars and thinking we could live there. They were, if you plotted them correctly, if you used the right projection, if you were Vel'Cathos and you had spent 40 years learning to see strategic geometry and spatial data, they were a ring. A loose, imperfect, organically constructed ring that surrounded a specific segment of Dominion space like a hand that had been slowly, quietly, over the course of decades, closing. Vel'Cathos sent a message to the Emperor. The message was classified at the highest priority level the Dominion's communication system possessed. It said, in the formal register of military crisis correspondence, "The humans did not react to our expansion. We reacted to theirs. I require an immediate audience." 3 days later, in a room that contained only 4 beings, the Emperor, Vel'Cathos, the Emperor's chief archivist, and that creature from the corner of the throne chamber that Mara Solis had noticed and filed. A conversation took place that would later be described in Dominion records as the recalibration. The creature from the corner was not Cathara. It was old enough that its species had no surviving members except itself, which had been the Emperor's unofficial counselor for longer than most of the Dominion's current noble families had existed. It had no name that rendered in any standard language. The Cathara called it, loosely, the one who was here before. It had observed humanity's development from a distance for approximately 60 years, which was nothing to it, which was everything to the situation. The archivist presented the evidence. The colony locations, the insertion timeline, the coordinated strikes, the pattern that once you could see it could not be unseen. The Emperor listened with his secondary membrane cycling through states that Vel'Cathos had never seen on an Emperor's face before. When the archivist finished, the creature from the corner made a sound. It was a very small sound. In the language it had spoken before any current living species had achieved tool use, that sound meant something that translated poorly into Cathara and even more poorly into any human language, but that carried something like, "There it is." "Explain," the Emperor said to the creature. He rarely addressed it directly. When he did, it was because he had run out of other options. The creature took its time. It always took its time. Its species had evolved in an environment where patience was not a virtue but a physical necessity, where the geography of their homeworld moved on timescales that made a Cathara standard year look like a heartbeat. When it finally spoke, It spoke in Old Cathara, the formal register, and Velcathos noticed that its accent was flawless in a way that no Cathara speaker's ever quite was, as though it had learned the language when it was young, which meant it had learned it thousands of years ago. It said, "You have been trying to understand what humans are by comparing them to what you have met before. This is the mistake. I have met 64 spacefaring species in my time. I have watched 30 of them end. I have watched 11 of them mature. I have never watched anything like humans, not because they are exceptional. Most of what they do is unremarkable by any standard. But there is one thing they do that I have not seen in any other form. One thing." "What thing?" the Emperor asked. "They practice," the creature said. "Everything. They practice dying. They practice losing. They practice failure deliberately, systematically, not because they enjoy it, but because they have evolved an instinct, cultural, cognitive, I cannot tell you which, to extract information from every version of being wrong. They have a word for this. They have many words for this. But the core of it is a belief, not a strategic calculation, an actual belief held emotionally, that the purpose of failing is to ensure the next attempt is different. They do not repeat. This sounds unremarkable. It is not unremarkable. Every species I have observed repeats. Repetition is the galaxy's default state. Comfort in repetition is the galaxy's default state. Humans are genuinely, physiologically uncomfortable with repetition. It disturbs them. They call this boredom, and they treat it as though it is a malady rather than an instinct, but it is an instinct, and it is the single most strategically dangerous trait I have ever observed in a biological organism. Silence. They placed those operatives, the creature continued, before any conflict existed, because they had already imagined a version of the future in which conflict existed, and they decided to prepare for that version as though it were certain. Not because it was certain. Because imagining future failure and preparing for it felt more comfortable to them than hoping it would not occur. You took 14 of their colonies. They expected this. They had already planned within this expectation. You reduced their fleet to 17%. I would estimate they considered this a satisfactory outcome relative to a contingency that required their ambassador to reach your throne chamber. The Emperor's secondary membrane had gone very still. "Satisfactory," he repeated. "They are not trying to win the war," Velcathos said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke it, the way some realizations do, not arriving fully formed but assembling themselves in real time from pieces that had all been present for a while. "They are trying to make the war costly enough that winning becomes indistinguishable from losing. They are—" He stopped. He looked at the tactical display, still showing the 14 disrupted systems. "They are not fighting us. They are teaching us what fighting them costs, and they are doing it slowly enough that we don't notice the lesson until it's already half over." The creature made that small sound again. "There it is." Mara Solis was not on a transport. She was not heading home. She was in a safe house on a Dominion administrative world. One of the 14 systems, as it happened, though not one that had experienced disruption, because some things need to remain intact for the endgame. And Quame had designed the signal with that precision. And she was doing something that would have puzzled the Cathara analysts watching her through sensors that she knew about and therefore never did anything interesting within range of. She was reading old books. Physical ones that she had brought in her personal luggage, an allowance that the Dominion's inspection protocols had permitted because books were not weapons, which was an assumption so deeply embedded in the inspecting officer's worldview that questioning it had not occurred to anyone involved. The books were not weaponized, but they were not random either. She was rereading, for the 14th time, a history of a war fought on her homeworld several centuries before spaceflight. A siege. A city. An army with no possibility of relief, surrounded by a force that by every rational metric should have broken it in 6 weeks. The siege lasted 2 years. The city did not fall. The besieging army eventually left not because it was defeated militarily, but because the cost of staying, logistical, political, psychological, the slow multiplication of smaller costs into an unbearable aggregate, exceeded what the besieging force had ever calculated it would be asked to pay for something it had assumed would cost almost nothing. She was not reading it for strategy. She had extracted the strategy years ago. She was reading it because the humans inside the city had known they couldn't win. They had known it from the first week. And they had continued anyway, not from delusion, not from false hope, but from a kind of arithmetic that was not about numbers. It was about what you were willing to cost the other side. It was about turning your own suffering into a calculation your opponent couldn't ignore. There was a particular passage she always returned to. A commander writing in a journal that would survive the siege and become part of the historical record, describing the faces of his soldiers after 14 months. Not their defeat, not their despair, their steadiness. A steadiness he could not explain, only observe. He wrote, "They have decided something I cannot name. Whatever it is, the enemy can see it in them, and the enemy does not understand it, and that lack of understanding is the last weapon we have, and somehow it is held." Mara put the book down. Quaim, sitting across from her, was doing something on a data pad that he would later describe to a debrief panel as routine maintenance, and that the debrief panel would eventually determine had Ray routed approximately 40% of the Dominion's local communication traffic through a pathway that recorded every conversation for a period of 3 months without triggering any of the Dominion's intrusion detection systems. "He'll send an envoy," Mara said. "When?" Quaim asked, not looking up from the data pad. 2 weeks, maybe 3, he needs to think first. He's not stupid. He's going to think very hard about this before he sends anyone. What does he need to think about? She was quiet for a moment. Whether asking us to stop is worse than letting us continue. Whether a ceasefire now looks like his idea or ours. Whether his court will understand the difference. Will they? Some of them, she said. The military analyst will. He's the dangerous one, the one who actually sees the pattern. The Emperor understands power. He might understand this. The rest of them, she paused. The rest of them have spent 6,000 years watching civilizations either join them or disappear. They don't have a category for a civilization that does neither. We're going to have to give them one. Quaim finally looked up. And if they decide it's easier to just resolve us, she looked at him. He knew the answer. He had known the answer before he asked it. He asked it anyway because sometimes things need to be said out loud. Then they spend the next 30 years discovering what we put everywhere while they were busy taking our colonies, she said. And they learn what resolved costs when the thing you're resolving spent 9 years deciding what to leave behind. Quaim was quiet for a moment. Then, did we actually put things everywhere? Mara picked up her book again. Quaim, she said, don't ask questions you'll lose sleep over. The Emperor's envoy arrived in 17 days. He was young for an envoy, which meant he was 300 years old by human reckoning, and he had the secondary membrane control of someone who had been trained from youth to give nothing away. His name rendered in standard as something close to precision, and he had chosen it himself at the Cathara age of majority, which told Mara something about him before he said a word. He arrived with a retinue of 6 and asked for a private audience, just him and the human ambassador. She agreed. Quaim sat in the hall outside and listened through a method that did not need to be described and that the envoy's retinue did not detect. Inside the room, 2 people sat across a table that had been set with human coffee and Cathara water salts, because Mara had arranged this meeting, and she had learned early that the details of hospitality communicate things that words cannot. The Emperor, the envoy began in standard, has asked me to explore the parameters of a suspension of active conflict. I know, Mara said. I proposed one 19 days ago. The envoy's secondary membrane did something brief and controlled. The proposal was declined at that time. And yet, Mara said, and let the yet sit there in the air between them. Certain strategic realities have become more apparent since that time, the envoy said. Certain strategic realities were apparent before that time, Mara said. I told him. He laughed. Another brief membrane movement. Mara watched it. She had spent 6 months before this mission studying Cathara secondary membrane chromatics from every academic source humanity had been able to compile, which was not a great deal, but was apparently more than anyone expected her to have done. She could read the movements approximately the way someone reads a language they've studied for 6 months, imperfectly, incompletely, but enough to know the difference between discomfort and dismissal. This was discomfort, Yes, the envoy said, with a precision that suggested every word was weighed before release. He did. He doesn't laugh now. No, she poured herself coffee. She did not offer any to him, not because she had forgotten, but because the Kethara formal register of negotiation treats an unasked for offering as a form of condescension. If he wanted something, he would ask. She had learned this from the same academic sources. The Emperor wants to know, the envoy said, what humans want, not the stated terms of the ceasefire proposal, not the diplomatic language, what humans actually want. Mara looked at him for a long moment. That's the right question, she said. It took him a while to ask it. Ambassador, we want to be left alone, she said. That's it. That is the entire answer. We want our 23 colony systems, which are full of people who went there because they wanted to live there, and we want to not be told who will be in 200 years, because we don't know, and we find the pretense that anyone could know both dishonest and philosophically offensive. We want to expand when we decide to expand and stop when we decide to stop, and not have to file the decision with an administrative office of an empire that predates our civilization's ability to keep records. She set down the coffee cup. That's it. That's all of it. We're not trying to break the Dominion. We're not trying to take anything that belongs to it. We're not interested in your supply chains or your infrastructure or your 6,000-year map. She paused, and for a moment something crossed her face that was not diplomatic, not strategic, not calculated, just true. We just want to exist on our own terms, and we will do an absolutely unreasonable amount of damage to make that point, not because we want to, but because once we've decided to, we are genuinely incapable of stopping. The envoy was quiet for a long time. The 14 systems, he said finally. Yes. The operatives placed before the conflict began. Yes. How far does it extend? She looked at him. She did not answer. She let the not answering be its own answer, which was more honest and more frightening than anything she could have said. I see, he said. I need you to take something back to the Emperor, Mara said. Not a message. A question. Ask him. Has anyone in 6,000 years of the Dominion's expansion ever tried to figure out why the species that didn't integrate chose not to integrate? Not why they were wrong to refuse. Why they chose to. Ask him if anyone has the record of that reasoning. Ask him if anyone thought to preserve it. The envoy said nothing. Because I think, Mara continued, that those species had something they were trying to protect, something they believed was worth protecting. And I think the Dominion absorbed them or contained them or resolved them without ever understanding what it was, which means the Dominion has been making the same mistake for 6,000 years and calling the mistake a success because no one was left to argue otherwise. And I want him to know that humans will always be left to argue otherwise. Not because we're special, because we are extraordinarily and sometimes self-destructively committed to arguing. The envoy rose to leave. At the door he paused. The ambassador, he said, spoke old court Kethara in the throne chamber. Where did you learn it? From records, Mara said. We did not release old court records to human researchers. No, she agreed. You didn't, he left. Quaim appeared in the doorway within seconds. Well, Quaim said. Make sure everything is where it needs to be, Mara said. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Either we're going to have a ceasefire in 3 weeks, or we're going to need all of it. Which do you think? She thought about the envoy's secondary membrane. She thought about the creature in the corner of the throne chamber, the one who had been there before the Dominion, the one who had watched 64 spacefaring species, and said there it is like someone who had been waiting to say it for a long time. I think, she said slowly, that the Emperor is going to go back and ask the creature in the corner what to do. And I think the creature is going to tell him something that frightens him, and I think he's going to agree to the ceasefire, and I think he's going to spend the rest of his life uncertain about whether that was wisdom or surrender. And I think that uncertainty is going to sit in the Dominion's administrative archives for a very long time, in a category that has never existed before. What category? Species that could not be resolved, she said, and chose not to resolve us. The ceasefire was signed 22 days later. The terms were, formally, close to what Mara had proposed in the throne chamber, close enough that the Dominion's court could read them as a negotiated outcome rather than a capitulation, which was important Because the emperor understood power, and understood that what power requires more than anything is the ability to maintain its own story. Mara signed it in the same room where she had met the envoy, at the same table, with the same cold coffee and the Cathara water salts. Quaim witnessed it. The 14 systems were restored to function. The colony worlds were acknowledged. The formal language avoided every phrase that might have felt like either side had lost. It was, on paper, a reasonable document. The kind of document that reasonable entities sign when they have decided that continuing is worse than stopping. The Cathara court celebrated it quietly, internally, as a strategic pause. The human parliament ratified it with 71% approval, the remaining 29% split between those who thought it didn't go far enough and those who thought it had cost too much. What neither side's official documents recorded was what the creature from the corner said to the emperor the night before the signing, in a private conversation that lasted 4 hours, and that was not officially witnessed. What the creature said in Old Cathara, in the accent of someone who had learned it thousands of years ago, was this: "You should know that I have never recommended a course of action to a Dominion emperor before this. In 4,000 years of counsel, I have observed and occasionally clarified, but I have not recommended. I recommend now. Sign the agreement, not because the humans are powerful, not because they cannot be defeated militarily. I believe they could be, eventually, at sufficient cost. But because there is a thing I have seen only once in my long observation of life in this galaxy, and I see it in them, and it cannot be strategically contained. The thing is this: they are not afraid of being remembered as the species that made you pay too much for too little. They are afraid of being forgotten. And those two fears combined produce a species that will do things no rational civilization would sanction, and will do them specifically because they have decided that being remembered for doing them is worth whatever it costs. You do not want to be the civilization they decide to make themselves remembered against. The Empire would survive it. I am less certain the Empire would recognize itself afterward. The Emperor had signed the next morning. Mara Solis returned to Earth 4 months later, on a transport that arrived quietly, without ceremony. Quaim met his family at the port on Titan before continuing home. 3 of the operatives who had been placed in Dominion space did not come home at all. 2 had died during the coordinated strikes, and 1 had never been intended to come home, a fact that Mara had known for 9 years, and that she would carry for the rest of her life in the specific way that commanders carry specific weights. Not with grief exactly, but with the permanent, uncomfortable knowledge that the arithmetic she had constructed had included people, had required their inclusion, and that the document now signed in a Dominion conference room existed in part because of what they had decided to spend themselves on. She gave a debrief. She gave another debrief. She gave testimony to a parliamentary committee that asked her, among other things, whether she believed the ceasefire would hold. She said she believed the Dominion would honor it, not from good faith, but from calculation, which was, she noted, an equally valid basis for an agreement, possibly more reliable than good faith in the long run. She was asked whether she believed humanity was safe. She thought about the creature in the corner. She thought about the Emperor's face when the laughter stopped. She thought about Velcathos, somewhere in the Dominion's administrative core, looking at a tactical display that showed a ring he had not noticed until it was closing. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the Dominion now understands something about us that they did not understand before. I believe that understanding changes their calculation significantly." "And what is that understanding?" She paused. She pressed her left thumb into her right palm, that old habit, that anchor in moving ground. "That there's no version of this that ends with humans stopping," she said. "That's what they understand now. There's no loss threshold. There's no cost that makes us stop. We'll adapt and change and try something different and keep going. Not because we're built for it, not because we're stronger, but because somewhere a long time ago, we decided that stopping was worse than continuing, and we've been passing that decision down through every generation since, and it's in us now the way breathing is in us, and we don't even notice it until someone asks us to stop and we find out we can't." The committee was quiet. "The galaxy," she said, "has mostly met species that stop when it makes sense to stop. I think, and this is not strategy, this is just my observation, I think we were probably the first thing out there that genuinely doesn't." In the Velith throne chamber, 6 weeks after the ceasefire, the Emperor stood alone in the hall before his morning audience. He stood where the human ambassador had stood. He stood in the precise geometric center of the audience floor as she had stood, and he looked at the space around him, the 47 places where his nobles sat, the great doors through which she had entered, the distance between where he sat and where she had been standing when she spoke Old Court Cathara in a voice that did not apologize for knowing it. He stood there for a while. His secondary membrane was still in a way that the servants who passed by quietly noticed and did not comment on. He was trying to complete a thought that had been forming since the moment the human woman had spoken, and he had laughed. The thought that his laughter had interrupted, that his certainty had buried, that Vel Cathos's report had unearthed, that the creature's words had given form. The thought was this: in 6,000 years of expansion, the Dominion had never encountered a civilization that looked at the full weight of the Empire bearing down on it and did not, somewhere in its decision-making, make an accounting of what it was worth. Every species, however briefly, had done the math, had measured itself against what was coming and reached some conclusion about what resistance could cost versus what submission might preserve. The humans had done the math too. He understood that now. They had done more math more carefully over a longer period than anyone had given them credit for. But somewhere inside the math, there was a variable the Dominion's analysts had not modeled and could not model because it was not a strategic variable, not really. It was something older and stranger and more fundamental. It was the conclusion the math kept reaching, regardless of the inputs. The conclusion that to the humans was not a conclusion but a premise, not an outcome but an assumption they had started with before the calculation began. The conclusion was, we continue. Not we will win, not we can survive, just, we continue. He stood in the center of the floor for a long time. Then his first audience arrived and he turned to face them, and his secondary membrane was perfectly controlled, and nothing on his face or in his bearing suggested that anything had changed. But Vel Cathos, who had known the Emperor for 40 years and who was present at that morning's audience, noticed something small. A quality of attention in the Emperor's gaze when he looked toward the great doors, as though he were listening for something. As though, somewhere in the vast quiet machinery of his 6,000-year empire, a sound had started that he could not quite hear yet, and could not quite locate, and could not stop hearing, and that none of his 6,000 years had prepared him to understand. Somewhere out there, beyond his borders, in 23 systems full of people who had simply looked at a star and thought we could live there, a species was continuing. He was not certain when that had begun to sound like something other than an ordinary statement of fact. He was not certain it had ever been anything else.